Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Expert Insights into Risk-Informed Tailings and Water Decisions. I'm Daniel Schneider. I am a decision scientist and project manager and independent consultant, and I'm happy to support the webinar. It's going to be interesting. I hope you find it interesting and insightful. And I wanted to make you aware of a few other webinars that will be coming up. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples across Canada and globally have had well-developed systems for integrating multiple perspectives in risk and decision-making. And I encourage you all to explore Indigenous practices in decision-making that they've used for thousands of years, as you'll find that some of the principles used in decision science are similar to those used. But I do want to let you guys know about some webinars that are also coming up. So on the next slide, in January of 2026, we have a webinar by Charles Dumaris, who will give an overview of the updated towards sustainable mining tailings guide from the Mining Association in Canada. I understand that it's very close. They're just in the final strides. And in January, Charles will give an update on that. In February, Andrew Thrift and myself will be presenting more about moving beyond multiple accounts analysis and finding the right tool for the jobs. We hope today you'll learn more about decision science and risk analysis, and we want to present a more wider array of tools beyond multiple accounts analysis and understand when multiple accounts analysis is the right tool for the job, and also identify other tools that will be helpful. In March, be teaming up with the Management and Economic Society to deliver a separate webinar. We're still in the works. And then in April, we're going to move into resilience-based tailings management. And that's a chance for Chad to share some of his insights from decades of working in this practice. And we look forward to that. And then in May, hopefully, we'll have a panel discussion, we'll have a short course workshop that we've submitted an abstract for. Now, for today's webinar, Andrew Thrift and I had the pleasure of interviewing experienced tailings practitioners from across the industry. As good decision scientists, we always start with what are the problems we're trying to solve and try to understand the challenges faced in the industry and what challenges they are. Now, then we reached out to our decision science and enterprise risk professionals, Diana and Bill and others, and tried to understand what their experience was and to find and suggest potential solutions to provide that have been successful at other places. Now, we've developed a series of questions to facilitate the dialogue, and Andrew Thrift will facilitate those, but we're also welcoming people in the chat or use the Q&A to engage, and this should be fun. You can introduce yourself in the chat. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat. We will have time about 40 minutes or so into the webinar to ask specific questions, and I'll look at the range of questions in there and we'll find a few to pepper in. With that, over to you, Andrew Thrift, to facilitate the dialogue. Enjoy.
Great, thanks, Dan. So as mentioned, we've got an interesting panel here and some gnarly kind of questions to address. So with that, as we advance the slide, I'll invite the panelists to jump on screen. So I'll speak to one of these top themes that we heard. This is a simplification of a lot of interesting nuanced comments, but we've tried to pull together a few key themes to hand to our panelists to address. The first one about managing uncertainty will be pretty obvious to those of you working in the field. You know, the uncertainty is inherent in tailings and water management. You have both the geological uncertainty, you're dealing with materials that you characterize a small portion of, water as well, high variability. So that's just a given in the field. And decision makers prefer certain quantifiable and near-term benefits. I mean, that's human nature as well. We've evolved to like that. And you tend to have a lot of accountants, mining engineers represented in those senior decision maker ranks are used to dealing in more quantifiable terms, easier to put things to numbers, more kind of rule bound and less uncertainty, relatively speaking. And always the near-term benefits. Tailings is fundamentally about risk management, and a lot of it is long-term risk, and it's challenging to talk about long-term benefits when there's near-term things. The proverbial, if I buy a haul truck, I know I'm getting this many more tons of ore hauled versus some measures to improve tailings risks, it's harder to say exactly what you're getting for that spend. One interesting note is that it's a lot easier to justify spending that is to improve safety, particularly life safety. Probably attributable to that something that is in the last 10 years being, with major catastrophic failures, something that people know, there's been cases of large lawsuits, individuals being prosecuted. So those are, vivid, and the compared to social environmental benefits, which tend to be harder to quantify, less certain, and less, I guess, present in people's memory of what they're trying to avoid as impacts, even though they could be as material. The communicating risks and benefits, the second one, is that it's challenging to translate technical risk into the business case to compete for investments across an enterprise portfolio. So again, if you're doing something saying like we're going to replace a pipe, and it may or may not fail next year or 10 years, and if it fails, we can't say exactly what the impacts will be, depends on season, etc. Versus if I'm buying a piece of equipment or putting something, upgrade in the mill, it's a lot easier to make a clear case for that. So even though those might be quite high consequences with low probability, you're competing against other investments, and there's always the attraction of deferring capital. There's always a need to tell decision makers or remind them of the why. People have said, even though we have a clear global standard potentially that was recent and we know why we had it, and people, board sign off, high level sign off, there's often experience of going back to the asset manager, the GM, and them saying, tell me again why we have to do this thing that is in our standard. So there's a bit of, the convincing needed. So support for investments is often contingent on building credibility and trust throughout the process. So that's a combination of the credibility of the people doing it, that articulation of it, and making sure that people understand the problem you're trying to solve early. Just because when you get to a budget process, things get lost in all the details of everything people are looking at all at once. The third issue that we heard raised most is around people and systems. And what we heard is that where people felt their decision making around tailings management was effective, is really contingent on having experienced people and with specific skills. So in one case, it was having some accountable executives who had been there for quite a long time, really understood the facilities, and so understood when there's a rationale provided, they understood the need and quite quick to endorse it. They appreciated how important that risk management was to the business. In other cases, it's someone who's really good at communicating the benefits and articulating the rationale, and recognizing that that may or may not be correlated with the technical merits of the argument, but if you're a good salesperson, quote unquote, you're gonna have more influence. And part of the challenge inherent that Chad will speak to later is you want to use your team, rely on those experts, those experienced people, but you also want a system that is not going to fall apart without them. And so the more you depend on those people, the less resilient you can be if you don't have good documentation, good change management, management of change, etc. So those are the three key themes we heard, and maybe bring us anecdotes we heard specifically when we get the discussion. But with that, I want to pass it over to the folks to have a response. So I'm going to first invite Bill to speak to that first theme about managing uncertainty and just some of what your experiences are. I skipped on the introductions, but you saw them in the PRAD. So each of these folks have decades of experience in their fields. Bill in decision science, energy and other sectors, Diana in enterprise risk management, decision science, Chad in tailings, and Chad will be familiar to many of you. So we're gonna let them kind of give more background as appropriate in their discussions, but we're gonna hand it off to the panelists each to kind of speak to one of these points, and we'll have discussion opportunities for them as we go along. So with that, I'll pass to Bill to respond to that first one.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Yes, I've been doing this for a few decades, and I keep running into the same problems. And we have an hour, the group of us have an hour with you this morning, and that means I have about 8 minutes to change your life on how you think about uncertainty. Um, Big challenge. So I'm gonna skim across the surface. You can dive deeper into any aspect of uncertainty. And I love talking about it. I can talk about it for days, but I'll try not to do that today. So one of the first things that we need to do is to understand that we really need a more structured approach to uncertainty. And I really don't like to use the word structured because that implies that there's a specific way to do it, and it's not true. There's really a toolbox of things that we can do and techniques that we can use to help us identify, manage, and do something about the uncertainty. It all comes down ultimately to what you're going to do. So even though you live in a world that's deterministic, think about it, everything that you can see, touch, feel, it's all deterministic. But that's not the world that we're trying to work with. We're trying to work with the future. And the future is not deterministic. It's only deterministic once you get there. So your future is uncertain. That's where we have to start with the tools and the techniques that we use, is to recognize and embrace that uncertainty. Now, I can say based on experience that without doubt, you spend too much and you take too long to do projects. There's several reasons for that, but one of the main ones that I've seen is the failure to understand what uncertainty is and how to deal with it. So why do you take too long? You try to be too precise. Precision is your enemy with uncertainty. You spend far too much time trying to predict what will happen and not enough time trying to predict what could happen. Now we're going to loop back into understanding decisions in that context. You have a wide range of what could happen, but you have discrete decisions across that range. You have discrete options, discrete optimal solutions across that range. When you are working with, well, when I've been working with many projects, the teams have always said, this is what I expect to happen. And we spend months or weeks trying to figure out what that is, what that specific result will be. That is not productive. I would like you to take a try at reducing the amount of time and effort that you put into predicting what will happen and recognizing what could happen. So instead of focusing in on a single thing, focus outwards to look at the range of what could happen. Now, not everything is important. So I wrote a paper a while back called 4 Simple Questions. And I'm going to go to that now. So Andrew, if you could pull that up. I have 4 simple questions to help you with projects and uncertainty in your projects. Not everything is material, but when we look at uncertainty in a project, there are 4 questions. Here's 4 questions that I like to ask. First of all, is the issue or risk material? Does it make a difference to the project? Does it make a difference to the flavor of the project? Does it make a difference to the risk associated with the project in a material way, a way that matters? The tools, and I'm just going to list tools here because I don't want to take up the full hour talking about nerdy tools here, but So the first thing that we want to do is we want to have an appropriate frame for our project, an appropriate decision-oriented frame. We have to understand what we want to achieve and what we can achieve, and our minimum fulfillment of our expectations. We're never going to be able to do have 100% fulfillment because there are trade-offs between objectives. You can't be absolutely the cheapest you possibly can be and also be the safest you can be. There are objective conflicts that we're going to have to handle. I like to talk about pain and regret and indifference assessment. Indifference assessment is more about understanding where your decision changes across the uncertainty, where you are indifferent between two options. Second question is, can you do anything about it? Pretty obvious. If you can't do anything about the issue, then you have to institute material, you have to transfer risk. You have to do more avoidance or backup planning. And some of the tools that I use here are, again, framing, option and threat assessment, pre-mortem. You'll have to look that one up if you're not used to that, with root cause analysis and mitigation planning. The third question is, okay, if you can do something about it, can you afford to do anything about it? That's the third question, Andrew. There it is. Can you afford, or in the concept of risk management, afford not to do anything about it? So there's a certain set of tools in here, mainly calculation-based, value of information, value of control, value of learning, economics and risk management tools. Those all come into play in here. Now notice the first two questions were qualitative. The second two questions end up being more quantitative. So question number 4 is, what if you're wrong? You've gone through this planning, you've gone through all of this. You have to figure out the probability that you're wrong. And what would you do? And Boeing approached me at one point, short little war story here. Boeing approached me with a little project, and they said that if they had assessed in a plane design, what if they were wrong, they would have caught a couple of significant errors. You can probably guess what they are, but I can't talk about them. So those are 4 simple questions that you should be able to ask on everything. And that'll help you prioritize your effort and give you a better basis for managing uncertainty and making the best decision. Okay, back to you guys.
Thanks, Bill. Sorry, that was my addition off the slide. That was great. So yeah, I'm hearing that, you know, with that whole world of uncertainty, that we tend to sometimes collapse into artificial is just one number, kind of deterministic thinking. That's if you can think about what you can practically do, which of those of that whole universe of uncertainties are the ones you can do something about, and then when do you care about changing your decisions. So that's a really practical set of tips. Dan or Chad, maybe Dan, I'll go to you first. One of you, anything you want to add on the topic of uncertainty that Bill has spoken to? You're still muted, Dinah? You're good now.
Yes. So I just would really emphasize, reiterate the statement Bill started out with, that there are the future has many possibilities, right? And that is really the essence of risk, that there are more things that could happen than will happen, right? So whatever you're not going to get it precisely right, but you want to get the range of the possibilities right. So that is so important when it comes to assessing risks and making decisions about risks.
Good, thanks, Dana. Chad, anything you want to add on that topic of managing uncertainty?
Sure. Quickly, I suppose, is I stand on my soapbox, including, during this webinar, I'll do it again about establishing resilience for a facility. So I really like the 4 questions that Bill has posed, because even if we try to understand, those failure modes that exist, there's going to be uncertainties, and some uncertainties that we're not able to identify. So question 4 about what if you're wrong, and marrying that with the definition of resilience, which is the capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulty. So something can happen that you do not have control of. Something can happen that you do have control of. But have we assessed all of those situations, including the situation that we don't know, right? And establish enough resilience for our facility.
Thanks, Chad. And one thing I'll add that I know Bill has done on projects I've worked on, which has been helpful, is getting a range of uncertainty where people have traditionally just given a single number, and I know it's deeply uncomfortable for some of the the scientists and engineers who are being asked for a number about, like, could it be this, could it be this, but you can do it, right? Bill, I don't know if you want to just speak to that briefly.
Yeah,
I'm
you can see I'm getting antsy here. One of the worst things that you can do when you're estimating is come up with a number and do a plus minus. Now, that's going to be a shock for many people, but it's one of the worst things that you can do, because you've built in all your bias into that middle number, and now you're going to do a plus minus. That just is not the correct way to do it. And yet it's endemic across many industries. Don't try to predict, try to estimate the range. And that's what we do when we look at creating ranges. I'm 90% sure it's going to be bigger than this number, and I'm 90% sure it's going to be less than that other number. And that helps you bracket the range without bringing in all of your bias into that center starting point number, because that's what poisons the soup.
Risk is
Thanks,
not
Bill.
a point estimate, right? It's not a dot on your risk matrix. It's a distribution. It's always a distribution. There are many, many possibilities of what the size and the implications of the risk could be.
Yeah, this is a whole separate webinar as well on expert licitation, which is fascinating, and it's something that we don't use much in the industry. Certainly energy, pharma, some of those fields use it a lot. And I think there's a lot to learn from how they do it. You don't need any underlying data, right? The more data you have, the easier it is. But anyway, we move on to, rather than risking the whole webinar on that topic. I'm going to ask Diana to speak to next to the second issue we articulate about communicating risk and how you kind of work within the whole enterprise risk kind of consideration. So Dan, I'll pass it to you, and then I think you've got some slides that I'll pull up as well. You want to speak to that.
Okay, so while you're pulling that up, I'll just say, so there were 3 main issues under the theme of communicating risks and benefits, the challenges. And so I'm going to speak to each of those with some ideas from risk management. So the first challenge was translating technical risk into a business case to compete for investment on an enterprise project portfolio. So the first thing I want to say is, and this is something even folks in risk management often don't understand, is that there is a calculus behind risk decisions, right? And that is this, that any decision relating to risk involves these 2 elements that are distinct yet inseparable. So the first thing is the objective facts. That's the first element. And that's where we tend to focus a lot in risk management and in evaluating different mitigations. At least we think we're focusing on the facts. The second element is a subjective view about the desirability of what is to be gained or lost by the decision. So if we go with that mitigation, what is to be gained or lost? And sometimes we think that's bias, but really what that is the sacred call that we are asking a decision maker to take, right? And so how you bring those two elements together, the objective facts and that subjective view, is really how you get that compelling business case, right? So I'm going to come back to that subjective view, that judgment call later, a little bit later, but right now I want to focus a bit on the objective facts. So specifically, I want to talk about using financial methods like net present value to evaluate potential projects or risk mitigation projects, because that's what's widely used by the finance function when they're evaluating potential investments, right? And especially in the context of capital budgeting and investment planning. So because it's a financial calculation, it has the appearance of being objective. However, the way that risk and uncertainty is handled by in net present value is by assigning a discount rate to account for risk and uncertainty. And that discount rate is a very blunt tool, and it is as much art as science when you're picking that discount rate, okay? So it's not a simple empirical calculation. It really involves the application of a great deal of judgment, all right? And we are letting one little discount rate characterize all the complexity and high levels of uncertainty with that future business environment. So that's far from ideal, because what it tends to do, especially in situations where there's a very long-term risk exposure, like we see with tailings, is that it basically makes many risk mitigations seem not worthy of investment, right? So we don't want to put the money in today for what we know we're going to need long term. Because when we use that financial method and a discount rate, it just hides the risk in many ways, or discounts the risk too much. So here's a couple of lessons from some other industries that have high consequence, low probability of events. So one I'm going to take from work I've done around in the transportation of dangerous goods, specifically looking at oil spill risks in marine transportation. And so there, instead of just using net present value, we really thought about the consequences in a tangible way. So instead of converting them just to dollars, we really looked at how many barrels of oil does that mean, right? So keep it in terms of the actual consequence. So, and when it comes to tailings risk, there's lots of tangible consequences to think about when we're building the business case. So the safety of people in the environment, public accountability, stewardship of financial capital, the reputation of the company and the decision maker, all kinds of things, ways you can think about quantifying risk, right, in a more tangible way. Another example is from the pension sector, where due to some unforeseen things that happened in terms of the investment returns, right? With the 2007, 2008 crisis in the markets, they came up with a way of calculating the ability to meet the future obligation, so the pension promise in the future, and basically came up with a financial calculation of the risk of how well the pension was fully funded, and whether it was, and if not, how far underwater it was. And that really enabled them to look at ways to mitigate that gap between the current level of investment and the level of investment that's needed to truly meet that obligation. And in the global standard around tailings risk management, there's a lot around what is the obligation. And then the second key challenge was decision makers need a constant reminder of the why. Here, I really want to talk about the, how you frame a decision, and it really matters. And we actually also have to remind the technical experts of the why as well. So on this slide, what you'll see is 3 examples of how of the solutions that to the problem of we need to move where we should locate. And the solutions are very different depending on the frame. So on the top right, we see the answer of where's the best environment for raising kids. So it's that country estate on the top right. On the bottom right, it's where would I find the most entertainment? And so maybe if that's the frame, we end up in a condo in the city where there's lots to see and do. And then what if we're just thinking about where would I have the shortest commute? Then we're thinking very, very narrowly on where we work. So, but it's not, so really your decision frame pulls together your values and ultimately leads to very different choices. And the frame is much more than a statement of the opportunity or the problem to decide. It's really a summary of the whole decision context. So this is what we learn from decision sciences, is what goes into that frame. And so that means taking some time when you're to frame the problem well, to make sure you've got a compelling business case. You've got to think about who are the stakeholders, what are their perspectives, why is that decision needed now, what's the nature of the items to be decided, what do we have to decide now, what can be deferred, who's going to make the decision, what are the values in play, what are the top decision criteria, and many more things. So you can see the frame really takes in quite a bit and really determines how you build that business case. So how do you get that frame right? So actually, not there yet, Andrew. So there's no right or wrong answer, and you are always trying to solve the right problem with the right people from the right perspective using the right values. And ultimately, it's for the decision maker to decide the correct frame and to adjust it as they see fit as the context changes. So here's the golden opportunity for Tailings, is to engage with decision makers to develop that frame, to confirm it, and to adjust it with them as changes happen in the decision context, or as more clarity is gained as you do more analysis and assessment at each stage in the process. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the third main point, which is responding to this challenge of getting support for investments and how that's contingent on building credibility and trust throughout. So one thing we really see with risk management decisions is and in the field of risk management over the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of work in figuring out ways to articulate risk appetite. Because what tends to happen in many organizations, we make decisions all the time, but if we haven't clearly articulated the risk appetite, we're on the left side of this picture, where it's tacit, it's implicit, it's intuitive, and so we're making judgments based on what our personal interpretation is of what our organization's risk appetite is. So that just leaves you wide open for all kinds of bias. By articulating risk appetite, we really make it clear what are the values that are important, and when we have to make trade-offs, how do we prioritize those values? What's the way we want to do that in our company? And so one of the lessons from this is that, I've worked with many executive teams and boards to develop risk appetite. They generally come into the process assuming everybody has the same risk appetite. And when we work through the process, it becomes really clear that there's lots of misalignment, and it opens up the opportunity to have a conversation about what should the risk appetite be. So even if your organization hasn't done a risk appetite articulation, you haven't done that in an enterprise way, You can actually do it on a small scale for any decision. And that's, comes back to the framing, thinking about the values that are going to be applied and the trade-offs that are going to be made, and how you want to prioritize those trade-offs. And by making that explicit, you have a much better chance of getting everybody on board and building that strong business case that has credibility and builds trust throughout the whole process. That's it.
Thanks, Diana. So rather than kind of having kind of some additional points from Chad and Bill right now, I'm gonna move to Chad next, just to make sure we have time to get a few questions from the audience potentially. So Chad, before we throw you that third point around the people side, one of the things we reflect on preparing for this is that, and you certainly been actively involved in this, is that decision making in tailings has improved a lot over the past 5-10 years. I'm wondering if you could just share your reflections of having seen that transition, being involved in some of the GSTM work around what improvements you've seen in decision making around tailings.
Sure. I think establishment of GISTM was important. I think that it should also be acknowledged that Mining Association Canada had also established towards sustainable mining, which have been adopted in I think 14 countries. I might be wrong with that number, but it had been adapted, adopted partway around the world as well. But GISTM really came about as a result of Brumadinho failure in 2019, January of 2019 in Brazil, and that caused the unfortunate loss of life of 270 people. The industry reacted to that, not just the mining industry, but the investment industry, the NGOs, everybody reacted to that event and said, boy, we need to do something, and probably an industry-wide tailing standard is required, even though TSM had existed, it maybe wasn't as recognized around the world as it could have been at that time. And so 3 co-conveners came together and established a standard. I think probably most people who are on the call are aware, to some extent, of GISTM, but came together and put together this standard of 77 requirements. It's not a perfect document, and I think I will be one of the first people to acknowledge that. But I also believe, use a Canadian football analogy. We marched down the field and we planted a flag, right, with that document. And maybe it's not perfect, but it's something that exists that didn't exist previously. It's been its conformance is required by ICMM of its members, but there have been a number of other companies that are aligning to GISTM as well. So it's been, I would suggest a positive development for the industry. The document itself leans towards the importance of governance in tailings management. There's some technical work in there, and I don't want to diminish the importance of good technical work, but the 77 requirements tend to lean towards more governance, including risk assessment, decision-making, good decision-making, like we're talking about here today. I think it's also important to note that the governance isn't just the people, it's the people, the processes, and the systems. So if you're having a discussion with somebody about has there been a governance issue or a governance failure, start with, just like risk, start with how do you define governance? How do you define risk? Because in my mind, the governance is the rules of the game established by the C-suite, right? So we go out as practitioners and we play the game. The frontline people are playing the game, but the rules are set up by the C-suite, and GISTM, put some requirements in place for those rules, including, I think
So go ahead, and after that one, just to segue to we've notched up quickly in governance. I'll next actually transition to that last point about, okay, so we've leveled up the game, then what are those other pieces around the people and systems that are kind of the next chapter of improvement?
Yeah, I think first of all, it requires the C-suite and the company to establish a policy for that company. So makes them think about their risk appetite, which Diana just spoke to, their safety case, if you will, when they set that policy up. But it also put key roles in place for tailings management. If we're talking specifically about the people, the engineer record, the responsible tailings facility engineer, the accountable executive, and the ITRB are the 4 defined key roles, and put some requirements around those as well. So not only do you have to have those roles, people performing in those roles, but some requirements around them. And I'm always reluctant to tell the story, but I will. But I was functioning in the role of an engineer of record 4 months out of university, put on to a project site. You are now responsible for all of the engineering that goes on at that tailings facility. Understanding that I couldn't stamp my own work and I had to go through senior review. Really, that was the role I was put in. That's not something that's acceptable anymore. Now there are required experience associated with that. And then the ITRB assurance as well, I think is really important. That's what I do now. I started as an engineer of record. I worked for BHP for a time as a delegate of the accountable executive. I've been a designer of record. Now I'm in this different role, for some mining companies as an independent technical reviewer. And really to summarize that role, you're the grandparent of the dam. So the engineer of record and I'm stealing this a little bit from what Andy Robertson used to say. The engineer of record and the RTFE are the parents. They're making most of the decisions. They're deciding how things should be operated. But the grandparents show up once in a while and they poke and they cuddle and they give advice and then they go away for 6 months, right? And the parents don't have to follow that advice. But if someone else was looking in, it would give them some confidence that there is somebody reviewing and providing some guidance as they go. In particular, it gives the accountable executive some assurance that decisions are being made well. Yeah. That's probably enough from me.
Yeah, no, that's great points around and role clarity. I mean, I think that's one of the things I've observed in some organizations where it's kind of if everyone holds hands and says kumbaya and you check with everyone, then maybe someone makes a decision. So having clear accountability means someone owns it. And I think that probably has influenced how much easier people are saying it is to justify things for safety reasons, because someone says, that's me, right? I'm the person accountable for that. And so that helps promote accountability.
What's more is that accountability needs to be maintained through the life cycle, and that's an easy arm wavy thing to say. But if your engineer of record has accountability over the design during the design phase, and then that design is handed over to some projects team who is going to manage construction. And I think we've all experienced, project teams that have some goal to reduce capital by 20% or whatever some magic number is. And anytime I hear, engineering optimization, I throw a flag, right? That accountability for that design still has to be retained by those individuals, all the way through that life cycle. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, one interesting story I'll add that we heard was, someone, everyone's got their roles in their organization. Someone saying, my procurement person comes to me and says, we want to competitively bid the EOR role every 2 years to make sure we're getting the best rates. And he said, look, there's going to be a 6-month handover paying 2 people, and you lose all the corporate memory. So that there's that importance of kind of experience in people isn't always, and I think they're successful in that argument to say this doesn't make any sense, but sometimes there is a lack of appreciation for how much rely on what is a relatively small set of people at a certain experience level to advise and support that system.
Agreed.
Bill or Diana, did you any comments you want to add on the people side?
Sure, I have a question. 77 things that you have to do would flood anybody's mind. Where do you see the errors most happening in the uptake of that 77 task list?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would suggest that many of us who have some accountability for achieving that conformance are technical people, but there is a strong social component to GISTM. And so one of the difficulties is actually pulling in those other technical resources. I don't want to call them soft sciences because that's not fair. Their jobs are difficult too, but to pull in those other technical resources that help with the consultation with affected communities, those types of things. I think another issue has been, what does conformance mean? And if we try to keep this high level and not get into each of the requirements, but what does conformance mean? And in my mind, ICMM got the definition correct in their conformance protocols. And it was something like, substantial completion has been achieved and it's supported by systems and processes. And I can use I think requirement 2.2 is for site characterization. You're never really done site characterization, right? So how do you say that you've achieved that requirement? Well, you've achieved some substantial performance and it's supported by systems and processes, and so you conform to it. Not all of the requirements are that way. Some of them are a specific checkbox, like you have to have done this, but I would suggest that the majority of them have some interpretation of what conformance means versus compliance, I'll say. And what is validation versus verification is another question. So those are some of the high level questions with regards to
I'm gonna interject, but Dana, did you have any comments on the people and systems kind of point before we move to a question from the audience?
So one thing I always like to talk about is when we're talking about accountability, for that's a really loaded term. So for most of us, we think about that term and we think about whose throat to choke, right? That's really what we think about with accountability. But I always hearken back to a project management person who turned that word around and said ability to account. So when we think about it in terms of our ability to account for whether or not we're making good decisions, then it brings us back to how well are we meeting that standard, right? All those requirements. And that's also helpful when someone is trying to change the scope of a decision down to an optimization exercise, right? Because if it becomes merely an optimization exercise, they're not thinking about all those other requirements, right? So just something to think about when we think about accountability.
Thanks, Dana. Dan, I'm wondering if you want to jump on and raise a question from that you've had come in.
Yeah, for sure. Great question from the audience. And it's, Diana, you touched on it a bit. The question is around thinking about comparable business case investment cases. Do you have any thoughts on quantifying the cost of avoidance? And I want to frame this around closure and water because, it's really hard to direct capital to these cost projects. The closure and water projects, there's this ballooning liability out there. And I've heard this too from engagement with different government staff that are managing some of the Crown contaminated sites across BC and the Yukon. They really have a tough time on saying, what if we don't do anything? What are the penalties that we could receive across any liability owner? And I think it really lends to what you were talking about, but maybe you can double click on that and share a few more thoughts.
Boy, I talked quite a bit about that already. So I think quite often, like those numbers, right? Those consequences can be so big, they scare the bejesus out of us, right? But they are in that distribution, right? So again, we don't know where we're going to be in that distribution, but it is a possibility that it could be those big numbers. So we do need to keep our eyes open to that. And when we're thinking about resilience, right? So here's another thing. So one of the things I noticed in the standard is it talks about zero tolerance, zero fatalities, things like that. So whenever in risk management we say zero risk, that means infinite investment. That's just what, and we don't have infinite resources. So what we're always trying to do when we're making these decisions is do the best we can with the resources we have. And if the resources are truly not adequate, find a way to finance proper mitigation. Right. So maybe I'll leave it there. And if the other two would like to, that's a meaty topic. I'm sure the other two panelists have thoughts on it.
You made me think, Diana, of the case where I was once working with a company that came up with a scenario that was equivalent to a meteorite hits the well. You know, okay, yeah, it's possible, but it's not a material threat.
It's a good way to think about it. Yeah, it comes back to your question on materiality. So and so I'm not saying, so here's the important thing, right? Because I too come from, you know, a safety kind of background. It's not about the morality of, you know, protecting people and the environment. That is absolutely our goal, to do that. But we have to be realistic about the resources we have to achieve that, right? So it is not, we don't have infinite resources, but we do need to also have an adequate, responsible mitigation plan.
It's in some ways about putting ourselves in the headspace of being very uncomfortable potential scenarios and ends of ranges, so that we've thought about it, at least, you know, made a reasoned judgment about which are the mitigations that we can invest in, you know, that are cost effective, appropriate, rather than pretending they don't exist. And then when they do hit, we just haven't thought about them at all. And that's art as well as science, for sure.
Yeah, and those and that's related to reputation as well, right? Because if we don't do those things, we put our reputation at risk, as both as a decision maker and as a company.
And as an industry, right? That's the thing with these others. They tar everyone with the same brush, and everyone is impacted by one party's failure. I'm going to switch to key takeaways. I'm going to share a screen again with. And we asked each of the panelists, okay, if you want to leave the audience with a few takeaways from what you shared, what are they? And so I'll invite Bill, then Diana, then Chad, just to speak briefly to recap kind of what you think are the key takeaways on those topics.
Okay, so the three things that I want you to remember that I feel will make the biggest impact on you improving your handling or management of uncertainty is: embrace the uncertainty. Worry less about trying to predict what the outcome will be and more about what it could be. Decision makers want certainty, but we know that certainty is not possible with an uncertain future. Decision confidence is a great substitute for the certainty of the false security of that one number that you give them. No, decision confidence. You give them confidence that given the uncertainty, that they're making the best decision. And then the final one that I want you to realize and take advantage of is knowing where your decision changes across that range of uncertainty, where you are indifferent to do two different things, is critical in uncertainty management. If you don't know where your decision will change, it's going to be impossible for you to understand the magnitude of what you can prevent or achieve. Those are my 3 points.
Thanks, Bill. One quip that I've heard that I really like, you know, when a decision maker says, why can't you just give me a number? Give me the number. I said, well, I'd be lying, because the chance of it being that number is infinitesimally small. You know, it's going to be something close to that. That might be a likely number, but the truth is it's going to be a range. And if I give you a range, even if it's just based on engineering judgment, professional judgment, without a ton of data behind it, that's a more accurate representation of reality. It does take a bit of computational work and a bit of flexibility of mindset, but I'm actually telling you more accurate depiction of what the world is, as opposed to something that is cognitively nice and tidy, but probably wrong.
And you're reminding me of the book by Pat Leach that is called "Why Can't You Just Give Me the Number?"
Yeah,
That's
that's a great book.
it's a really good book. It's a simple, it's a smaller book. It's easy to read. Get it and read it.
Yeah, good point. Dana, over to you on the second point about communicating risk and benefits.
Right. So continuing with that theme of why can't you just give me the number? So the calculus of risk management decisions involves these two things, right? The objective facts and that subjective view of the potential gains and losses. So first of all, you want to make sure that the objective facts that you bring to the table, that they're presented in a compelling way within the narrative of the business case. And the second big takeaway is how you frame a decision really matters, and that having a correct frame, appropriate frame, drives both the quality of the decision that you eventually make, and it really defines the narrative for the business case, right? And it allows you to engage with that decision maker, right? To keep emphasizing the why, to make sure it's clear and present in the mind of the people doing the analysis work and of the decision maker who has to make that judgment call at the end of the day. And then finally, getting clear and about and explicit about risk appetite. It is really essential for transparency and alignment around when making decision calls across a portfolio, right? So in order not to get lost in, in the fray of all the investment decisions or calls for investment that decision makers are facing, you really want to make sure you're aligning with the risk appetite of the organization.
Great points. Yeah, I like the point that Chad made around, policies and guidance are ways of articulating risk appetite in a context, right? So if the folks responsible for long-term planning and having time to think about it, think, you know what, we don't want to build new upstream dams, right? Okay, let's put this in, and then we've made that decision so that if people are pressed on cost on a design, like they don't say, well, maybe this time we can justify it. And so there's an art form to not being too prescriptive, having enough, but that's one of the ways we encode that. Chad, I'll transition to you to speak that people and systems point.
Yeah, I think mostly when we talk about people and systems, the big message I wanted to get across was what I'll talk more about in April, about resilience and tailings management. And in my mind, I imagine this big Venn diagram with leading technical work on one side and effective governance on the other. And it's not a perfect illustration because that's not really what Venn diagrams are for. But in the middle where they overlap is this good tailings management, this resilience, this toughness, this ability to take a punch and stay standing, right? And so I believe everybody, all of those key roles, anybody who is doing engineering associated with the tailings facilities or has accountabilities and responsibilities should be asking themselves, how resilient is my tailings facility? So some of those questions might be, and these are from real examples, except the first one's a little optimistic, but what if the team won a lottery pool and everybody left? And so I did see a site where almost the entire management structure, right down to the frontline people, all decided to leave at about the same time, just coincidentally. And so during that period, there was nobody who knew really how that facility was ran, and the company had no choice but to rely on that leading technical work, part of the Venn diagram. So during that time, that circle was really big and the governance was really small, right? And then another example is how do you maintain accountability? We talked about this. How do you maintain accountability in those roles through the life cycle so that you can have more reliance on on the governance side, we know that we've got good people in place who have good accountabilities. And then the middle one actually is an example that really did come up recently, which is if we had to evacuate the site for a week because of a hurricane, who's watching this facility? How is it being managed? We can't intervene, if something goes wrong, if flood management isn't correct, as an example, right? And so, again, we have this big reliance on the design during those periods. Like we can walk away, not be able to, see the facility and still have some reliance that that facility is resilient. That's probably, I see the time is just about done, so it's probably where I'll stop.
Thanks, Chad, and thanks all panelists for your contributions. Lots of great insights, and I know everyone on this call is personally committed to avoiding the types of failures we've seen in the past, and knowing that, to Dennis' comments, this is over for the long term, right? These are some forever facilities, and it has to be everyone in the world forever, not having those. And so we need all the layers of Swiss cheese, if you use that safety metaphor, in our favor. And hopefully some of these insights from decision science and enterprise risk management are a few other tools in that tool chest, that what Chad's talking about as well, resilient systems that give us a few more slices of Swiss cheese. So thanks very much, everyone, for participating. Thanks for the questions, and hope you have a good day.
Thank you. It's a privilege.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.